Good evening from Alexandria, and welcome to the Alexandria Center for Hellenistic Studies and Institute for Mediterranean Studies Neoplatonic lectures. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Pieter, who is going to open the autumn lecture series with a talk on Aristotle's criticism of the theory of forms between Athens and Alexandria, Syrianus and Asclepius, on the arguments for the existence of forms. So Pieter is professor of ancient philosophy and director of the KU Leuven de Wolf-Mansion Center for Ancient, Medieval and Renaissance Philosophy. His research focuses on epistemological and metaphysical issues in post-Plotinian Platonism. He is co-editor of the Oxford Classical Text edition of Proclus' commentary on the Parmenides, and of the collective volume All from One, a guide to Proclus. And he's also the director of the KU Leuven Institute for the Study of the Transmission of Texts, Ideas and Images in Antiquity, the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, Lectio. So Pieter, thank you very much for accepting the invitation. And the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Irini, for those very kind words of introduction. And thank you, of course, for inviting me in the first place to this wonderful project, to participate in this wonderful project between Athens and Alexandria. When I got the invitation a while ago, I thought that I would try to live up to the expectations and do something on Athens and Alexandria, Athenian commentators, Alexandrian commentators. And so at the time I was working on a small project on Asclepius' commentary on the metaphysics, and also working on a paper which had some comparisons between Asclepius and Syrianus. So that will basically be also what I will be presenting today here in this meeting. So talking about Alexandrian Platonism, about Athenian Platonism, with a particular case study, which is focused on the arguments for the existence of forms, such as we find them, at least referred to, in Aristotle's Metaphysics, especially Book Alpha, Chapter 9, of course, and Book Mu, Chapter 4. Because, of course, much has been said and written about the relations between the Alexandrians and between Alexandrians and Athenians. Of course, we've heard all these stories from a while ago that in Alexandria there would have been this very simplified, or to some extent simplified, variant of Platonism. That was one of it. Well, this has been nuanced a little, I think, in more recent research. Then there's also, of course, this big issue, which I will address today, about to what extent Athenian Platonists or Alexandrian Platonists believe in the harmony of Plato and Aristotle. Well, I think basically there is an agreement that there is this basic harmony between the two philosophers, but then to what extent and how does it influence their own thoughts? Now, a couple of years ago, Aristotle has written a book on this, Alexandrian and Athenian and Alexandrian Neoplatonism, in which she gives this picture of like a basic basic belief in the harmony, the symphonia, but then with some variants, some degrees of harmonization. But at some point in the book, she also makes the point, well, actually, we have very little material to compare these two schools because we don't have commentaries on the same works. And that makes it a bit difficult, of course, to compare this. because when you're commenting on Aristotle, it's natural to be somewhat more involved into the author himself, and so you would naturally be more inclined to look for harmony, to see what you can actually use for your Platonism. Well, but the point is, of course, that there are some works which we do have and where we can find some comparisons, and I think the case that I will present today may be a case in point. We have, of course, two commentaries on Aristotle's metaphysics, not all on the same books, of course. But these commentaries are written in these two very different environments, and I think they will allow us to make some comparisons. So I will do that, focusing myself on this short section in Alpha 9 and Mu 4, where Aristotle says that, well, is of course in the context of a big criticism of the forms, and then at some point he says that, well, the arguments that the Platonists use to introduce forms, well, they are either inconclusive or they prove too much, in the sense that, well, they don't actually offer what they are supposed to offer, namely arguments for the existence of separate forms. Or if they do, well, then they have other undesirable consequences, namely that they introduce forms of things of which they in Alpha, so the Platonists are not ready to accept forms of. And Aristotle refers to several arguments, to the argument, so-called argument from the sciences, the one over many argument, the argument from the object of thought, and then he also refers to what he calls more accurate arguments, which have other undesirable consequences. And in that context, well, some of these arguments introduce forms of, or are involved with forms of relatives, and while others introduce the third man. So this is the section basically that I will be talking about today. And I will share my handout just to give some further context before we move on a little more. Just let me see. Okay, so this is, I hope you're now all seeing my screen with my handout. And so this is more basically the program that I present for you today. So I will say a few more introductory thoughts, or give you some introductory thoughts, just to bring everyone on the same page about these commentaries and about the general approach that Syrianus and Asclepius seem to take on Aristotle's criticism of the forms in general. And then afterwards, we'll be looking at least some of the arguments in a bit more detail, and like having really this comparison between how Syrianus on the one hand and now Asclepius on the other hand approach them. So I will not be so much concerned with whether Aristotle is correct in attributing these arguments to Plato, whether his criticism is actually fair criticism. No, I'm just concerned with the exegetical strategies that Syrianus and Asclepius adopt to approach them, and see how, to what extent they are different or actually agree with one another. So that will be my concern today. Just very briefly, so we have these two commentaries on Aristotle's metaphysics, two Neoplatonic commentaries, I should say. Of course, we have a third one, which is important for both of them, namely Alexander's commentary, Alexander of Aphrodisias. But for Syrianus, we have commentaries on at least books Beta, Gamma, Mu, and Nu. We also have some fragments of comments on book Zeta preserved by Asclepius, but it's not entirely sure whether that would actually mean that he also wrote a commentary on that book. But it's not necessary in any case to suppose that he would have written a commentary on the entire metaphysics. Some of the reasons, some of the arguments are explained also in the introduction. So, in the introduction to the Ancient Commentators translation, and also Michael Frede has written a paper about that. I think the most convincing argument for this is that, well, actually, Syrianus seems to be using Alexander very much as an exegete of Aristotle, and he seems to accept him also to a large extent in that role. So there was apparently no need really to write new commentaries on the books that we also have from Alexander, except for those books where important Platonic issues may have been at issue. So, for instance, books Beta and Gamma, where of course the object is to define the science of first philosophy, where Syrianus presents a Neoplatonic take on this. And then, of course, particularly also books Mu and Nu, where actually Aristotle provides a straight-on attack on the doctrines of forms and numbers from the Platonic Pythagorean tradition. And I think Dylan and Omeric call it in their introduction a kind of Syrianus commentary on this, at least a kind of antidote. So something had to be said about this, because inexperienced students, well, they may easily be led astray by these comments. So someone should reprove them. Someone should prove Aristotle wrong. So that's the interest. That seems to be the interest of Syrianus in commenting on this text. Then we have the second commentary by Asclepius, which is who was working in Alexandria in the 6th century. Asclepius, who was, of course, a pupil of Ammonius, who himself studied with Proclus in Athens, but then has developed this quite different approach to the harmony, at least, of Plato and Aristotle. And that's also very much reflected, I think, in this commentary by Asclepius, also partial commentary, of course. What's important is that, well, both these commentaries rely to a large extent, different extents, but both engage clearly with Alexander's commentary. I think this has very clearly been shown also by Conchita Luna in her book about these three commentaries, also looking at the relations between them. And so I think this actually does provide as an opportunity to compare the different attitudes towards the harmony of Plato and Aristotle, because of course, Alpha 9 and Mu 4, they cover much the same material. And so we find actually the same kinds of text there as well, the same kinds of arguments there. Dealt with a bit differently. So this is how it's usually portrayed, these two different approaches. Syrianus, representative of the Athenian school, which would be more critical, more polemical towards Aristotle. I think this is very clear in Mu and Nu, and also, for instance, in Proclus's commentary on the Timaeus, in the prologue to that commentary. That's more or less like the most polemical you would get to Aristotle, I think. And then on the other hand, Asclepius, who usually is considered to be a more, let's say, more charitable reader of Aristotle, someone who thinks that Aristotle actually is much more easy to harmonize with what we have from Plato's doctrines. So just a few passages very briefly to illustrate these two approaches. I think this first passage is a passage which is relatively well known, because Père Safré has written a nice paper about this a few decades ago, and this is from the introduction to books Mu and Nu. So in the preface to this commentary on these two books, Aristotle actually starts by expressing his big admiration for Aristotle. Admiration, so Aristotle is a good guy. You can learn a lot of him, especially with respect to logic, with respect to ethics, with respect to natural philosophy. But there is a problem, especially in these two books, Mu and Nu, where Aristotle is actually attacking Plato very clearly. And so this cannot be left unanswered. And that's what Aristotle, what Syrianus is here moving on to. So he first gave some praise, and then he writes the following. So, however, since it is the fact that for whatever reasons, both in other parts of this theological treatise, so of the metaphysics, and especially in these last two books, Mu and Nu, he has indulged in a good deal of criticism of the first principles of the Pythagoreans and the Platonists, while actually never presenting any adequate justification of his position, and in many instances, if one may state the truth quite frankly, not even meeting them on their own grounds, but rather basing his objections on hypotheses propounded by himself. So for all those reasons, it seemed reasonable, and then I left a piece out which says that, especially for students who are not yet very much acquainted with this, it seems reasonable to subject his remarks to the best of our ability to a judicious and impartial examination. We'll have to see to what extent this is really impartial, but we get indeed Syrianus trying to weigh the Aristotelian arguments against Plato, and to demonstrate that the doctrines of Pythagoras and Plato about the first principles remain free of disproof or refutation, while the arguments of Aristotle against them, for the most part, miss the mark, pursue lines of inquiry quite irrelevant to those divine men, while on the few occasions when they seek to make a direct attack on them, they are unable to bring to bear any refutation, large or small. So I think the message that comes through is quite clear. So what Aristotle is doing in Mu and Nu is attacking Platonism, or at least trying to attack Platonism. That's the first point. And the second point is that, well, this attack is completely unsuccessful. And Aristotle actually does not live up to the expectations here. He has not properly understood, and his own doctrine is not in agreement. And so what we get in the commentary is a refutation of these criticisms, which very often presents itself in the form of a refutation of Aristotle by Aristotle. So what Syrianus is often doing is to actually use Aristotelian doctrines or conceptual tools and turn them against Aristotle to make him see that actually, when he was true to his own philosophical views or opinions, he should have agreed with Plato, even if he's not aware of that. So there's some kind of a harmonization going on, but it's more with a very critical, polemical tone to it. This gets very different, I think, when we get to Asclepius, who is much more obviously harmonizing these two philosophers on the subject of the forms. And here I've taken a passage from the beginning of his commentary on Alpha 9 in the translation of Gerson in his book Aristotle and Other Platonists, where Asclepius writes the following about the criticism in Alpha 9. Aristotle here seems to be opposing Plato on ideas. So interesting. He's trying. He seems to be opposing. That's what you get at first glance, of course, when you're reading those pages. But actually, that will be Asclepius' point. He's not. Why not? Well, because actually, if you understand Plato's theory of forms properly, in the sense that forms are not just separate in any absolute sense, but they are separate from sensible particulars, but they are present within a divine mind, the demiurgic mind, as logoi, then you can actually find agreement with Aristotle, who himself says that forms, that the proper place for the forms is actually in the soul and in the intellect. And so Asclepius here quotes a few, refers at least to a few Aristotelian passages that he finds in agreement with his doctrine about how he understands Plato. So two of them are from the Anima. So the idea that the soul is the place of the forms, and then also the passage from the Anima 3.5 about intellect in potency, which acts, and intellect in actuality, which makes. And then also this passage from Metaphysics Lambda, intellect in actuality as being identical to its objects. So he says Aristotle himself straightforwardly places ideas in the intellect. So the question is then, why, might someone say, if he's elevating ideas, and if he basically agrees with this, does he seem to be quarreling with Plato? And the answer is, well, that's actually not what Aristotle is doing. We reply that in reality, he's quarreling not with Plato, although elsewhere he does, in fact, may have some quarrels, but with those who have posited these ideas as existing by themselves and as having been separated from intellect. Thus, the whole conception of Aristotle regarding ideas has become clear to us. So, on the 2 points that we talked about in Syrianus, so Aristotle is attacking Plato, and his own doctrine is not obviously in agreement with Plato. It could be if you would think his own principles through, but he does not think he's in agreement himself. On these 2 points, Asclepius obviously holds a different position. So the attack is not on Plato, but misconceptions of Plato's views. And actually, the doctrine that you can get from Aristotle is basically in agreement. So Aristotle is not an opponent, but some kind of an ally of Platonism here, right? So these are like the basic positions, let's say. Now our question is today, how these positions translate into exegetical strategies once we get down to the text. So does this really make a difference actually in approaching the text and in particular arguments? And so, as I said, I will be concerned with the arguments for the existence of forms attributed to the Platonists and criticized by Aristotle. Well, these arguments are, of course, just alluded to in the text that I referred to, Alpha 9 and Mu 4. But luckily for us, Alexandrian's commentary on the metaphysics took the trouble to copy some of these arguments more elaborately, which Aristotle actually developed in his work on ideas. A work which both Syrianus and Asclepius clearly know only through Alexander, so they don't have much more, they don't have anything more than we have today. But it is interesting to see that they're also involved with these arguments in their commentary. I mean, for Asclepius, that may seem quite obvious, commenting on Alpha, but I think that the same holds very clearly also for Syrianus in his commentary on Mu, in the sense that his refutation of Aristotle's metaphysics is at the same time presented as a refutation of what Aristotle writes in On Ideas, where he just elaborates on the same issues, basically with no new arguments. That's what Syrianus says here in this passage, which is one of the 2 passages where On Ideas is referred to explicitly in the text. So I quote here in Dylan and O'Mara's translation that he has in fact nothing more than this to say by way of confutation of the theory of forms, is made plain both by the first book of the present work, so by Metaphysics Alpha, and by the 2 books which he composed on the forms and ideas. But it is by hawking around everywhere pretty well these same footling dialectical arguments, epichere diminutive, which is very rare in Greek, but which I think testifies to his dismissal of these arguments. These are just petty arguments, sophistical arguments, which actually don't live up to really providing a kind of refutation. So it is by hawking these arguments, in some cases subdividing them, splitting them up, in others presenting them in summary form, that he attempts to confute the philosophers senior to him. But I imagine that will not escape the notice of the more alert reader, even if such dialectical commonplaces were many times multiplied, they remain on a level proper to themselves, far removed from the science of divine things. So even there, I mean, no actual refutation is actually given. So they don't deliver what they intend to do. And so what I will try to show, that at least one of my worries is that in responding to Alpha 9, Alpha and Nu 4, Syrianus and Asclepius are at the same time also responding to the arguments such as we find them in On Ideas. And so then I come to my my philosophical discussion, let's say, of some of these arguments. I have selected passages from 3 of these arguments. We may be a bit short of time and not come to the third, but I think that case is the most well known, so there shouldn't be any worry. I'll try at least to get you through the first two arguments, the arguments from the sciences and the arguments from relatives, and then draw some conclusions from there. But we'll see how we proceed. I can pretty much stop anywhere because I will go faster if necessary. Okay, so first the arguments from the sciences. The arguments from the sciences is the first referred to by Aristotle in Alpha 9. It's one of these arguments which either prove too little in the sense that they don't really provide sound arguments for the existence of separate forms, but at most we learn from ideas of universals. Or they prove too much in the sense that they also imply types of forms or forms of certain things of which the Platonists were not ready to accept them. Now, this is one of the arguments reported by Alexander. So Alexander reports 3 arguments from the sciences. This is the second one. I quote only this one because I think this is the argument with which Syrianus will be very much engaged with in his commentary. I'll just read it very briefly. So further, the things that the sciences are sciences of, these things are. So these things are real beings to some extent. And so this is Fine's translation. And the sciences are of some things besides the particulars. For these, that is, the particulars are indefinite and indeterminate, whereas the sciences are determinate things. Therefore, there are some things besides the particulars, and these things are the ideas. So this should be a proof of ideas based on the fact that the sciences actually they concern real beings, and these real beings are then the forms. So Alexander goes on to also report 2 objections that Aristotle makes against these. As I said, they either prove too little or they prove too much. So either they don't really establish the existence of separate forms, but at most of universal terms, besides the particulars, or they prove too much in the sense that they imply forms of which the Platonists don't accept any. And Alexander, like in his in the quotations that he gives us, he makes it clear that this is actually about the objects of the techni, of the crafts. So if according to this argument, there should be also forms of the objects corresponding to the crafts, not only to the sciences particularly in the very narrow sense. That's the idea. So this leads to a incoherent position, and so this needs to be proved, of course. So how will the Neoplatonists go about in approaching this? Actually, very much by taking Aristotle's factual claims at face value. So I will not be concerned with the question whether this is actually an accurate presentation of Plato's own position, but it is very clear that the Neoplatonists, both Syrianus and Asclepius, but this is more or less a common assumption, they defend a very restrictive view on the range of Platonic forms, where actually forms of substances and anything that contributes to this substance or to their perfection is more or less the central category of their theory of forms. And so if this is the case, we should find a way to both save the argument from the sciences as a sound argument for the existence of forms, but at the same time also avoid this unnecessary consequence or this undesired consequence of introducing forms of artifacts and forms of things falling under the sciences, as it is said. And this is a passage from Syrianus' commentary where he actually deals with this argument in his comments on mu4. Let's read. So Syrianus actually starts and this is, I think, something which it does quite often, with actually a construction of the argument. So trying to get what Aristotle is doing by reformulating it. So the claim used to be made also by these men, the Andres. Usually those are the Platonic Pythagorean philosophers. So he seems to be accepting there's some kind a genuine argument. If the sciences are concerned with real objects, if they are perita onta, then universal entities exist. For the sciences are concerned with universals. And then he constructs a syllogistic, or provides a syllogistical construction of these arguments in the syllogism of the third figure. The objects of the sciences are real beings. The objects of the sciences are universals. So therefore, some universals are real beings. That's the point. So there's here a textual problem. It's Bonitz actually who suggested, in addition to the text, which I have modified a little, but those details should not concern us here, I think. In any case, so this is the construction of the argument, leading us to the acceptance of at least some universals being considered as real beings. And Syrianus puts much emphasis on this particular conclusion, some universals, tina. And he elaborates on this by bringing in the late Neoplatonic doctrine on the three types of universals, or at least alluding to it. Because he said, well, for not all universals exist, not, for instance, the later born, no, those that inhere in individuals, ta entois atomois. But I think this is an allusion to these three types of universals, the universals, or the common term before the many things, the many sensible particulars, the common term which is to be found within the sensible particulars, the in re universal, and then the common thing which can be derived from the universal, so the abstracted universal, more or less in the Aristotelian sense, which is often called later born universal. And so the point that Syrianus seems to be making here is that, well, of course, we should not accept forms of all types of universals. Only these universals which correspond to forms and which are actually universals before the multiplicity, they are, of course, corresponding to forms. And the point that he makes elsewhere about this is that, well, science, of course, deals with the causes. Well, since forms are, of course, causes of sensible particulars, we cannot construct syllogisms, syllogistic syllogisms, just basing ourselves on abstracted universals. No, we should actually take the anterem universals, which are the causes of these developments within particulars, as our starting point of the syllogism, which is one way of saying, of course, that, well, we should accept a restricted theory of restricted view on the correspondence between universals and Platonic forms, and this also applies to the sciences, because then Aristotle comes to, Syrianus comes to the second objection by Aristotle, namely the idea that by the same argument one would also introduce forms of all things falling under the crafts. And this is what Syrianus has in response to that. But, he said, there's nothing strange in the claim that all objects of the sciences are real, if, and that's a big if one takes that to refer to the objects of the proper sciences, ta kurios episteta, and not, for instance, the objects of medicine or carpentry. So Aristotle, on ideas, gave these examples of medicine and of the art of construction, and not carpentry properly, but I think it's basically referring to those kinds of examples. So those are not proper sciences. For these are not sciences in the proper sense, but one might just term such only those which concern themselves with objects that are eternal and exist by themselves and are always in the same state. So what is Syrianus at here in this passage? I think it's very subtle. Of course, it's not a very clear refutation of Aristotle of Aristotle's terminology, but I think there is some reason to think that what Syrianus has in mind here is that, well, of course, there could be, you could use the term episteme in a loose sense, comprising also technai. For instance, in the first two chapters of the metaphysics, Aristotle seems to be using also technai in this sense, conflating it with episteme. But there are other ways of looking at this, for instance, as Aristotle himself does in the Nicomachean Ethics, in Book 6, chapters 3 and 4, where he makes this clear distinction between episteme as being involved with objects that are eternal, that are unchangeable, that are necessary, while on the other hand, techne is concerned with things that are subject to change. And this seems to be what he's implying here as well, referring to this eternity, and objects that are eternal and exist by themselves and are always in the same state. That's of course then Platonizing this same idea with this typical Platonic expression, which usually refers to the ideas. So actually making the point, I think that that of course there are only there's only science there's only forms of sciences in the strict sense, in the proper sense, and that's of course about the form. So we need forms for this, right? So I think what you see Syrianus doing here is at least engaging with Aristotle's argument, with the objections that Aristotle makes, and trying, if you would allow me this reading, at least have an element of also turning like Aristotelian distinctions against Aristotle, even though I think here it's very implicit, of course. So one may disagree about this, but this last one, but okay. Then we come to Asclepius, and let's have a look at how he deals with this issue. In Asclepius, we first get a paraphrase of the argument, but a paraphrase which is actually quite different and has some surprise in it, in the sense that for him this seems to be concerned with the idea of science, not the ideas of the objects corresponding to the objects of the sciences, at least not in the first place. Let's have a look here. Indeed, if they say that the ideas exist for the reason that despite the absence of a science properly speaking here below, they agree that there is science, then there is an idea of science. Estin ara ideates epistemes. So this seems to be a bit stronger in some sense, to the extent that Asclepius seems to be implying that according to Aristotle's reasoning, there is this issue of whether there can actually be a science here down. So I think there are reasons to think that Asclepius is also thinking about the greatest difficulty argument in the Parmenides. We'll come to that later on, where I think that idea is a bit more explicit, but the idea that, well, there is no proper science on our level, so we should move on to some other level, and that will be more expressed more explicitly a bit further down. So that according to what they say, there are forms of all things, for there is also science of the products of art and of things contrary to nature. So here is still Asclepius reporting the argument as he sees from Aristotle. And the strange thing is he introduces not just the objects of or the products of art, but also things contrary to nature, which are not concerned with in Aristotle's argument, neither in ideas nor in the metaphysics passage. but which in Neoplatonic theory were, of course, very closely connected to one another, as being both not according to nature. And some of them then are just not according to nature, artifacts, others are contrary to nature, opposing nature in a sense. So that there will be ideas of these two things too, since it has been said that there are ideas of all things of which there is science. So this is how he reconstructs the argument, how he understands Aristotle's argument, which is at least, well, less obviously a report on the argument that we get on ideas, of course. And then what Asclepius in the remainder of this passage then does is to justify why he thinks that one should also be concerned here with ideas, things contrary to nature, and with things which are products of the techni. That are sciences of things contrary to nature is evident from this. Indeed, the physician does not only know what is in conformity with nature, to kataphysin, that is to say, the causes of health, but also the causes of illness, insofar as he chooses the former and avoids the latter. So I think this may be may remind one also of this idea in the Phaedo, of course, that there's just one science which concerns the opposites, and therefore we should also accept forms of things contrary to nature if we accept science of objects that are according to nature. And then, of course, similarly, the builder has the knowledge or the science and the episteme to build the house or the wall, and likewise for many other experts. So this is also an example that Aristotle took, that of the building art as one of these sciences, one of these crafts to which there should also correspond forms, according to this argument from the sciences. And then we get finally to the response by Ammonius. We know that this commentary is an Apophonous commentary from Ammonius, as I said at the beginning. Here we get the answer how Ammonius would go about it. And this is also a bit surprising me, I think. Now, our philosophy master said that Plato did not speak of such a science. So these sciences in this very broad, loose sense, but of immaterial and universal science, which is the art of the arts and the science of science, of sciences. Techne technon kai episteme epistemon, which also knows all beings absolutely as beings, both those that will be and those that could be, both universal beings and particular beings. But such a science cannot exist but with God alone. Paramonoto theory. So that even from this, we conclude that there is an idea, presumably an idea of science. So what do we get here? And I think this is the reason why earlier on I said there are reasons to think that there is some conflation also with the idea, or with the greatest difficulty argument in the Parmenides, because here we clearly get the idea that actually there is no such thing for Plato as a science of things here down. But Plato only accepts this idea of this one science, the science of the forms, which, according to the greatest difficulty argument, I mean, the problem that is introduced there is that if forms are separate, and if there is, then there can be no knowledge of the forms down here, but only God will have knowledge of the forms. So I think it's more or less reminiscent of that passage. But what is interesting is that this is apparently so the only science for which we should actually accept forms here. And Asclepius says this with while using a very particular expression, that of the techne technon kai episteme epistemon, This is an expression that he also uses elsewhere in his commentary on Book Alpha, namely in the first chapters, where this expression is actually an expression that he uses for Aristotelian first philosophy, so the science of the first causes and principles. So one could see that this is some kind of an attempt to conflate these proper science of the forms, and at the same time this first philosophy in the Aristotelian sense. Very importantly, but this science cannot exist but with God alone. So these forms exist within the demiurgic intellect. That seems to be the idea. So just going on this argument, what we have here so far, we see that Syrianus first present like a brief reconstruction of the arguments before then responding to the different objections. Possibly, if you would allow me that interpretation, already pointing to some distinctions that Aristotle is prepared to make elsewhere, but not here in his discussion with Plato. Asclepius' paraphrase, on the other hand, seems already not to be just faithful to the argument that is reported by Alexander, but already introducing Platonic concerns in his paraphrase of the arguments, then preparing then for actually also his defense of Platonism, or the way that his master Ammonius actually dealt with this most supreme science. So yeah, despite, let's say, a more charitable approach to Aristotle elsewhere, and also in the introductory passage that I showed you before, I don't think we should say that Asclepius is less Platonizing Aristotle here, at least not in this passage. So that's a first case study, let's say. Let us look then at the next argument that I want to speak about today, the argument from relatives. And I will try to be a bit quicker for reasons of time. The argument from relatives is, of course, one of the more accurate arguments that Aristotle refers to in the Metaphysics, and which are then also reported by Alexander in his commentary. And I will just briefly go through the main, what is this? Sorry. Briefly provide a summary of the arguments to get us on the same page before then looking at the commentaries of Syrianus and Asclepius on this argument. So this is not a translation, just a paraphrase. So basically the argument seems to go as follows. There are three ways, Aristotle says, in which a predicate can apply non-harmoniously to a multiplicity of things, which share things that sharing the same name, but have more than just a name in common. Either the predicate applies to all of them in a proper sense, kurios, like when we apply the predicate man to both Socrates and Plato. Either it applies to them not kurios, but as things which are likenesses of things that have the predicate kurios in the proper sense, as when we predicate men of different pictured men. Or, and this is the final option, the predicate applies to one of them as the paradigm and to the others as its likeness. For instance, when we say Socrates is a man, but also his picture is a man, his portrait is a man. And then the argument goes, well, when we predicate a particular predicate, namely equality of sensible particulars, neither A nor C actually applies to this. And so why not? Well, we cannot say that all sensible equals are equal in exactly the same way. We have equality, presumably sticks and stones may be equal in length, but they may also be equal in weight, or they may be equal in shape, or other reasons. So the account of equality is not the same in each of these instances. So they are not all having the same predicate kurios. Nor does C apply, because within sensible equals, there's not one of them serving as a model for the other cases. So there's no paradigmatic case of equality in the sensible world. But that leaves us only with one option, and it is option B, namely that all sensible equals are actually likenesses of that which is properly equal. And that's then, of course, the equal itself, the form of equal. And that's why this argument establishes this kind of forms. Now, why is this? I'm sorry, but I have the impression that you're not always on the same page as I should have you. So this is, I hope you now see my page 16. So one of the questions is first, why is this a more accurate argument? Well, because it does not just introduce universals, but it actually introduces forms with a specific function, namely as models, as paradigms, which exist in themselves. So this is more accurate in this sense. What is then the problem with the argument? The problem is not that it leads to undesired types of forms as with the other arguments. No, it's called the argument of relatives, and it introduces relative forms because it actually makes use of an example of a relative, namely equality. It relies on a form of a relative. And what is then the problem? Well, that the Platonists actually, even if they don't do this explicitly, they should have rejected ideas of relatives if they were to be true to their own views on the substantial nature of forms. So forms are substantial, relatives are not, and therefore this leads to conflict. And this is how Alexander reports this idea. For in their view, the ideas subsist in themselves, katautas, being in their view kinds of substances, whereas relatives have their being in their relation to one another. I quoted this because I think this is the main point with which at least Asclepius and also Syrianus to some extent are concerned. So what's here the Neoplatonic strategy in responding to this argument? The idea would be to say, well, of course, we have all these examples of forms of relatives in the dialogues, and then Syrianus is clearly thinking about those, so we should rescue them. There are forms of relatives, but we should also find a way to say that, well, they're not actually relative themselves. They have some kind of substantial nature within the intelligible realm. And actually, Aristotle, at least that's what Syrianus implies, actually Aristotle has no reasons to disagree with it because he goes a long way in the same direction. Let's see how this is done. So this is the beginning of Syrianus' response to the argument. What Syrianus does not do here is to provide some kind of a reconstruction, but he replies to the question of the existence of relative forms immediately. And say, well, of course, we don't accept forms of all kinds of relatives. Insubstantial relatives, they don't have any forms. But there are types of relatives which do have forms, or which we should relate to forms. And that's, of course, the interesting cases here. Let's read again in a slightly modified version to Numera. We do not claim that there are forms of insubstantial relations, nor yet of those involved in change, of which which owe their existence to some circumstance other than natural, or for instance, above and below, right and left, nearby and far away, and such like forms. These are just merely accidental relations, which presumably are just connected to the physical constitution of objects. If objects are somewhere located in space, well, they should have these kinds of relations between spatial positions, obviously. But that's merely accidental. It doesn't affect their own nature. But on the other hand, there are, of course, substantial relations as well, relations in which the essence of things is involved, or relations that things have because of the particular essence that they have. And for these relations, Syrianus seems to be prepared to introduce at least intelligible principles. But that can come about in two different ways, as we read here. Such things as by reason of participation in some forms have come to be relatives, as for instance, like or equal or different. Of these, some are endowed with relation to each other through participation in the genera of being, others through participation in at least one of the forms. Now, this is a thought which we find a bit more elaborated in Proclus' commentary on the Parmenides, where he says that, well, for instance, likeness can come about in two ways. Either through participation in the form of likeness, or because two sensible particulars actually participate in the same form and have their relation of likeness because of that. Because, of course, as being proper productive causes, forms produce effects that are like them, and hence this likeness also results a likeness between those sensible particulars. And so this is the idea here. Yeah. But this seems to be important. So, like the first, This second type, of course, does not involve particular forms of relatives, whereas the first explanation that some relations result from participation in the general being would, of course. And these are the interesting examples, as these are the Platonic examples of forms of relatives, which Syrianus seemed to want to secure, of course. Forms like likeness, equality, and difference. This seems to be a restricted amount of forms, which all could be related in one way or another to the Magister, again of the Sophist. Also, likeness and equality, we know from other passages, are related to them in the sense that likeness is, of course, sameness in the category of quality, whereas equality would be sameness in the category of quantity. So that I think is the idea. So for this restricted range of forms, we should apply or we should introduce at least separate forms. But then the question is, of course, does that mean that there are relatives, or that there is relativity in the intelligible? I'm sorry, but each time that I go to the next page, for some reason, I get back to my previous, to one of my previous. But so I'm now continuation of text 9 here, which provides us like this idea that, well, even though there are forms of relatives, they are not relative themselves. Why should it occasion surprise if we declare that some things that are relative entities, that are prosti, in our realm, should be perfected by virtue of those forms, when there also we are prepared to leave a place for this relationship, though on the level of real being? So we have substantial relations there, relations which are usiodes. And actually, this is something which Syrianus says Aristotle himself has nothing to object to, because this is actually what's also implied in his own views. Not just merely us who are positing this, but also Aristotle himself. For when we postulate that one thing is a cause or a principle or a primary or more universal, while another is caused or derivative from a principle or secondary or more particular, what else are we doing than attempting to indicate the order in accordance with which divine entities are mutually related? So I think Syrianus here switches his focus again a little. So he's not anymore concerned with forms of relations, but of substantial relations existing within the intelligible. So between intelligible entities, which have all kinds of hierarchical or causal relations, which should be accounted for some way. So there are some relations present there, which are substantial relations, of course. Now, Aristotle himself, after all, holds the view that of the separable forms on which he postulates that the spheres of the universe depend, some are primary, others median, and others lowest. Some are more comprehensive and others less so, if at least those also have that ranking as between each other, which the spheres of the ether exhibit in relation to one another. So the idea is that Aristotle himself, for instance, in his cosmology, accepts substantial relations, which of course, for Syrianus, implies that we should also accept intelligible principles of these to some extent. Okay. So here I think we find a clear like ad hominem strategy to involve Aristotle actually as being not in disagreement if he would have thought through his own views elsewhere. Okay, let us look now at Asclepius and how he goes about this. I think we basically find a similar strategy of differentiating between substantial and insubstantial relations, even though his take on this is a bit different and in a very interesting way, I think. Let us read. So first we get his view on Aristotle's argument before he then presents the views of his own and his master, Ammonius. So this is a part of the paraphrase. Again, he says that the ideas are of things by themselves, while relatives, do not exist by themselves. Indeed, as is said in the Ethics, and this is a reference, I think, to Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 4, where Aristotle is talking about, or is criticizing Plato's form of the good, by saying that, well, good is something which does not exist only in the category of substance, but also in, for instance, in the relative, which is just an offshoot of substance. So as he said in the Ethics, relatives are like offshoots and cling to trunks because they have their being in the other categories. Now he proceeds, since relatives exist, there are relatives, there are existing relatives like father and son relations, right and left, and since they say that there are ideas of things that exist, it is clear that there are ideas of relatives too, if it is true that he himself, namely Plato, postulated the great and the small, which are shown in the categories to belong to the relatives, and that the relatives exist even before the others, since he postulated the great and the small as prior, because it is from them that he engenders the other things. That is Plato. So there seems to be a confusion between saying things that Plato postulated the great and the small, but then Aristotle shows in the categories that there are relatives. So the subject seems to be changing a little, but what is most surprising here, I think, is not the fact that there are relations that should exist somehow, but the example that Asclepius gives here. For Syrianus, it was quite clear that he wanted to rescue the Platonic examples, the examples of relatives that we get in the dialogue, which also, of course, is then the example that Aristotle uses in On Ideas, example of equality. That would have been the obvious example to use here, but instead that's not what Asclepius is doing. He refers to the great and the small, which he probably found also in Alexander's commentary and also in metaphysics elsewhere, of course, Alpha, as being given in a very different context, which he here uses as example of a relative. So it's not so much concerned with the Platonic examples, which is itself already telling to some extent, I think. So that there will be ideas of relatives, not only of beings by themselves, as they said, and these ideas of relatives exist even before beings that exist by themselves. So until here, this is Aristotle's reasoning according to Asclepius. Now, what should we provide in response to this? How should we actually respond to what Syrianus is, to what Aristotle is doing here according to Asclepius? Let's see. Now, we say in reply to this that in reality, there are indeed substantial relatives in the nature of things. And of these, there are ideas. So some relations are substantial, and we should account for them by referring them back to intelligible principles. And because of these substantial relatives, there are also non-substantial relatives. Now, this is a phrase which is not particularly clear to me. I have some thoughts which we could discuss about what this may mean, but I would be very happy if others have suggestions for this as well. In any case, he gives some examples of substantial relatives. For example, the liver is on the right, the spleen on the left, and it is impossible for them to be replaced. If we replace the liver and
όχι μέχρι το μοναστήρι, λίγο πριν.
That would actually cause harm to the organism and stop its proper functioning. Likewise, the earth was giving place in the middle, the sky in the region around it, so also a cosmological example here. And of these things, there are substantial demiurgic logoi, since such relatives are observed also in the substance of things. And if it is not possible to observe the right and left outside of sensible things, one should not for this reason conclude that its logos only exists by accident, because it is impossible to observe anything accidental near the demiurge. So the bottom line is there are substantial relations, and the substantial relations that Asclepius is concerned with here are substantial relations between sensible particulars, not the kind of examples that Syrianus was using. But because there are substantial relations, they should be caused by intelligible principles, so logoi within the demiurgic mind. That seems to be the bottom line. But of course, keeping into account that these logoi in the demiurgic mind are themselves not relatives, but are the causes of relativity in this world. What is strange so far is that we don't have much concern with the examples that we get in the dialogues, the example that Aristotle is using. So Asclepius seems to really be concerned with substantial relativity between sensible objects. And so his concern is a bit different from what is actually at stake there in metaphysics passage, I think. And if we read just a few lines on, that's very clear that indeed Asclepius finds his inspiration for this solution that he sees, not within the context of the discussion here, but in the context of the commentaries on the categories, actually, where we have this distinction between substantial qualities and non-substantial qualities. The qualities that are symplerotikon, which complete the essence, that is sensible substance, and other qualities which are not. And this seems to be his distinction, because substantial qualities in the sense of qualities and relations contributing to sensible essence of things, they should be somehow corresponding to intelligible principles, and others not. Let's read here. These are classical examples which we find in the categories commentaries. Indeed, such accidents are substantial. As we say, there is a logos of heat in the demiurge because of the substantial heat in fire, and of humidity because of the humidity in fire. And because of these substantial accidents, the other accidents exist as well, just as there is a logos of white because of snow, for white completes the essence of snow. Indeed, even if it is possible to separate the white from the snowy thought, all the same white is a completing part of its substance and has affinity with the substantial. And that seems to be the criterion here. Does it contribute to the essence of sensible particulars, and not the concern that we saw in Syrianus with the kinds of relations which are not limited to sensible particulars, but which are connected to what he called like the general being as structuring principles, also of intelligible reality, of course. Okay, so this is then the passages that I want to show about the argument from relatives. a very brief conclusion here about these passages. So they both seem to agree on the point that there are forms of substantial relations, but that these substantial relations are, of course, themselves not relatives. They have some kind of substantial existence within the intelligible, even though the kinds of examples that they're thinking of seems to be quite different. And so we get these Platonic examples in Syrianus versus these more on the categories tradition inspired examples in Asclepius. And what's also interesting to see was that in Syrianus we have this kind of ad hominem remark by Syrianus directing himself explicitly against Aristotle, where this, of course, is removed in Asclepius, and he actually quotes a similar cosmological example just as a part of his own strategy. As I said, well, we don't have time to go through the third case, I think, which is about the third main argument. I think this is also the most well-known case. There's a very nice study by my colleague Jan Opsomer about Syrianus' interpretation of it, in which he presents also the solution that, according to Syrianus, what you need to remove the regress, or to block the third main regress, is of course deny synonymity between forms and particulars. And Syrianus does that in a very particular way by understanding the relation between forms and sensible particulars as a case of what Shields called broad homonymy. There are passages, especially from these fragments on metaphysics zeta reported by Asclepius, where he also seems to use the predication aphenos kai pros hen as an interpretation of this particular relation that forms and particulars have. And all these elements, so this denial of synonymity and then some kind of a broad, putting in place some kind of a broad homonymity between forms and particulars. And then this use of the aphenos kai pros hen predication, these are things that we also find in Asclepius. So there, again, we find like a very similar strategy within the two commentaries, but again, with a basic disagreement, at least on the kind of approach that we find towards Aristotle, in the sense that Syrianus uses these Aristotelian conceptual tools as a response to Aristotle, say, well, Aristotle, you got it wrong, you should have thought about this more accurately. Whereas in Asclepius, again, we have like a removal of all these polemical components. And what Asclepius actually says is, well, is that on this, I'll just show you this very short passage. In this way, Aristotle actually refuses those who assume that the ideas exist by themselves in separation from the demiurge, because in his view, once you understand forms not as being separately existing by themselves, as things in themselves, so to speak, but as demiurgic logoi, actually there will be no synonymity anymore, and there will be no further regress anymore, because that's just where the explanatory framework stops within the logoi of the demiurge. And then, so this is the passage that I want to show with this aphenos kai pros hen predication applied to this relation between forms and particulars again. So here, again, so the disagreement is mostly about the formulation, not so much about the solution itself, but about the extent to which Aristotle actually got it right consciously, and not just as an implication of what he should have said based on his own views, as Syrianus would have it. So these are my conclusions. Sorry for being a bit long today. So both Syrianus and Asclepius develop Platonizing strategies, of course, to interpret Aristotle. And we started from this take of Syrianus as being much more explicitly critical of Aristotle. But I think that we can say, at least, for instance, in the argument from the sciences, and also in the third main argument, I think it's quite clear that at least Syrianus is ready to engage with Aristotle's text to some extent, trying really to see what the objections are and trying to refute them from within an Aristotelian perspective. Whereas on the other hand, Asclepius has a much more charitable rhetoric in his approach to Aristotle, also in these passages, nowhere opposing Aristotle straight on. But he's certainly not less keen on Platonizing Aristotle's doctrines, in the sense that he finds inspiration from different angles to actually impose some of his own Platonic convictions upon Aristotle. So I think no real or no obvious disagreements, major disagreements on the doctrine, but agreements on to what extent Aristotle could actually be made an ally of Platonism, and well, could be made an ally of Platonism, but in what extent he would actually be happy of being an ally of Platonism, I should say, perhaps. Okay, sorry for this somewhat longer presentation than I had anticipated. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward, of course, to your questions.
Thank you, Peter, for your penetrating talk. We have plenty of time, so you shouldn't worry about being too long. So please, are there any questions or remarks? Could you please use the chat or raise hands, but perhaps the chat would be easier. Alberto?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Peter. I have a question on a text that you quoted on page 12 of your handout, where Asclepius is talking about the science of sciences, and there is the reference to the science cannot exist but with God alone. And I was wondering whether that could be interpreted as meaning that only God possesses this science of sciences that is not accessible for human, or whether, because you gave an interpretation that was different perhaps, but I don't think that I catch it maybe. So I was curious about how do you interpret that?
Well, so my interpretation, or the way that I thought it had to be understood, was against the background of this greatest difficulty argument. I think there are some indications that Ammonius's interpretation points us to this direction, because he, for some reason, relates the argument to not just ideas of the objects of the sciences, but he's talking about the idea of science, of knowledge, the form of episteme, which is which is something that plays a role there in the argument as well, of course. And because well, we have this suggestion in setting up of the argument that what the argument should be concerned with is that there cannot be a proper science of things down here, but only at the level of the forms, let's say. And so those elements bring me to this interpretation. I think that was also suggested already by Cardullo in her notes to the translation, by the way, that actually what is at stake here is this idea that a proper knowledge of the forms is actually something which surpasses us on this level, and so accepting actually the counterfactual implication of the greatest difficulty argument that a proper knowledge of these forms can only be attained at the level of the gods, of this god which has this idea of science which relates then to the other forms in some sense. So that was at least how I thought the argument or the point had to be understood. And this is then, of course, the demiurgic logoi being the forms contemplated by the demiurgic mind, and therefore the only agent which actually understands the forms at their own level, so to speak. But so you had a different interpretation or different view on that?
No. Now I understand better. So thank you very much for the clarification.
Thank you.
Well, I would have a couple of questions if there are no questions for the moment. So the first one would be more general. So if my understanding is correct, your conclusion is that the agreement between Plato and Aristotle is equally prominent in the schools of Athens and Alexandria, but that it is the personal approach that can be different.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one,
Sure.
would you prefer that?
No, just however you prefer. Shall I respond to that and perhaps say something about the general approach? Well, because I think to some extent that is indeed the issue. What I found, not just in these passages, but also at some other passages in the commentary, is that, well, if we're talking about harmonization, there is a difference to be made, of course, between to what extent are Plato's and Aristotle's doctrines de facto combinable, or to what extent can they be harmonized on the one hand, and then on the other hand, to what extent do commentators like Syrianus and Asclepius think that Aristotle actually wanted to be in agreement with Plato. And on this, a very interesting case, I think, is also this famous idea that Ammonius seems to have had, that the Aristotelian intellect is not just a final cause, but also an efficient or productive cause. And he seems to have written an analogous treatise to actually bring forth arguments for this. Now, that's a very interesting case, because what we find, for instance, in Proclus and Syrianus are arguments which go more or less in the same direction, in the sense that in Proclus' commentary in the Parmenides, but also in the metaphysics commentary of Syrianus, we find arguments which say, well, Aristotle, why do you not accept that the intellect is not just a final cause, but also an efficient cause? Because if you were true to your own views about the intellect contemplating itself, knowing itself to be a cause, that means, and knowing itself to be a cause, you should also know what it causes, etc. So this leads us to the idea that the intellect actually should have knowledge of the forms. Now, this in Syrianus and Aristotle is presented as an undesirable consequence for Aristotle. So something which, if he were true to his own views, he should have arrived at. But in fact, he doesn't. Whereas sometimes you find like similar arguments in Asclepius and Ammonius, which take a different strategy. They're saying, well, actually, if you think through Aristotle's views, he actually does accept the productive causality of intellect. So we have two things. I think that they agree that intellect actually should be not just a final, but also productive cause, and that on Aristotelian principles, you can defend this. But whereas Syrianus and Proclus are not prepared to attribute this view to Aristotle, because he doesn't develop this explicitly, I think very often Ammonius and Asclepius attribute views to Aristotle, views which he which by implication he actually defends, even if he doesn't say that explicitly. And sometimes even the exactly same arguments come either within a polemical context in Syrianus and Proclus, or with a more explicitly harmonizing component in Ammonius and Asclepius. So that was the basic take, let's say, on this difference.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Shall I move to the next question?
Please.
So it is about T10, text number 10.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder whether you would like to say a little bit more about this. Because of substantial relatives, there are also non-substantial relatives, and you said that you had some ideas and that you could perhaps say a little bit more.
Well, I'll just share the text again. That's a difficult thing, because I also said that I'm not quite sure about this, but I will try nonetheless. Because, well, this is a puzzling thought, but a thought which Syrianus actually, Asclepius actually mentions twice, both in the case of relatives, and because of these substantial relatives, there are also non-substantial relatives. And then again, then in the case of qualities, and because of these substantial accidents, there are also accidents, also other accidents exist. Well, one wonders what this could actually mean. Are insubstantial relations or insubstantial qualities derived to some extent from them? One could think, for instance, well, snow is white, and there are other things which are essentially white, so they belong to this kind of substance. But then when I make an artifact out of this substance, well, it of course retains this color, but that color is merely accidental, but it could have been any color in which I make this artifact. So is it that kind of thing? But that's perhaps a bit too easy. Or could then be the idea perhaps that, for instance, it belongs to sensible objects to have surface and hence also to have color. And so this why is this so? Well, because some of these sensible objects, they should be distinguished by essential qualities. But then, of course, the implication is that also other objects, which doesn't necessarily are linked to a particular quality or particular type of relative, will also be characterized by it because of the ontological structure of sensible reality or something like that. So I was thinking more or less along those lines, but I would be very, very happy if anyone could come up with a good solution or a good suggestion for this, because this is not yet very clear to me either.
Yes, thank you. My impression was that they somehow derive, but yes. Thank you. I see there is a raised hand. Gregory Scott, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I was worried about time and I typed it out, so we can just read it faster probably, or maybe there's somebody on a telephone who cannot see it. So I will read out what I've just typed in the chat. So I found the historical account fascinating and possibly perfectly accurate as an account of how Syrianus and Asclepius argued. However, based on 2 publications and an upcoming one by Vera Calci that I will now summarize with only 1 point each, I think they were both addressing the youthful views of Aristotle and the earlier Academy of Plato. You offered a caveat about not evaluating the correctness of the arguments for Plato and Aristotle, and I wonder how the other publications, especially the upcoming book by Vera Calci, appearing in December of this year, that George Boy Stones recently advised me about, might impact your account above and beyond showing that Asclepius is more accurate in emphasizing forms as conceptual form ideas. That is, both Plato and Aristotle evolved their ontotheological views, according to my publication. And one matter of harmony was that by Laws, Book 10, Plato only held conceptual form ideas, not transcendental, or also known as ontological forms, right? Capital. Aristotelians can easily accept form ideas, of course. We all agree on this, yes? This is demonstrated in my article from last year. Plato imitates Aristotle, Alcmaeon of Croton, Phaedrus 245, and Laws 10. The link to it is in the more recent publication that introduces David Sedley's and, oh, sorry, Georgie. I meant it's George, not Georgie.
Sure.
George Boy Stone's work on Antiochus, whom, as in case you forgot, anyone, is 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE. And actually, he was unknown to me until I read George's work. Antiochus had been taken before George and David Sedley to accept transcendental forms, which would contradict my conclusions that Plato gave them up by Laws, Book 10. But George powerfully argues that Antiochus accepts only form ideas. And here's the link that gives you the references, and that leads to the last two pieces. George also let me know of the upcoming work that supports my findings as cited in the footnote. So you can get the information from the footnote from that PDF. Calci argues that it is Philip of Opus who offers the first Platonism without transcendental forms. If she is correct, then since Philip reputedly edited the Laws shortly after Plato's death, arguably Philip immediately recognized that the Athenian had relinquished ontological forms and proceeded accordingly. Asclepius and Syrianus were simply unaware of the evolution of Plato's thought. So I would like to cite your presentation, Peter, when it is ready for citation, because it helps show how Alexander mistakenly determined the modern interpretation of Aristotle's ontotheological thought in the metaphysics. Whereas I believe my publications, which are also cited in the link I just give, have amply demonstrated that not one peripatetic after Aristotle or anyone else for 500 years until Alexander either accepted the unmoved mover, even thought the unmoved mover was important enough to discuss rigorously. They all considered the doctrine of the unmoved mover worthless, and it was only Alexander who has given us moderns this very, interpretation of the unmoved mover. Anyway.
Thank you.
It's a lot there. You may not have anything to say, but.
Thank you. No, I mean, thank you so much for these thoughts, which indeed point me already in different directions as well. So it's a very complicated matter that you're touching. Let me just perhaps add a few things. So I think indeed, both for Asclepius and for Syrianus, Alexander seems to be some kind of an authority in the interpretation of Aristotle. That's quite clear. At least even Syrianus, who would not agree with, of course, how Alexander presents Platonism or explains Aristotle's representation of Platonism, he at least sees the worth of Alexander as some kind of an exegete of Aristotle, someone who is reliable to that extent, at least. Now, another thing is, didn't these commentators take into account the evolution within the Platonic dialogues? And there, I think the answer may be a bit disappointing, in the sense that no, to a large extent, the Neoplatonic commentators were very strong Unitarians, in the sense that there is some kind of a system in Plato. And looking at the different dialogues, you should just try to reconstruct it from the dialogues. It may not be very explicit there, but different parts and pieces have to be put together. If there's a truth, it should be eternally have been the truth to some extent. So there's no real sense of an evolution, I think, throughout the dialogue. So that's certainly also a very accurate point indeed. I'm afraid I will also have to look at some of the publications that you're referring to, but that's, let's say, what I can say for now, at least.
And if you can send me the citation information.
Sure. Okay.
Do I need to?
I'll happily do
I can find your email, I guess, somewhere easy, right?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Taran, Harold.
Hello.
Hey,
Two very much smaller questions. First of all, you just revisited the theme of Syrianus's dependence upon Alexander's view of Aristotle. Of course, that clearly works all right for beta and gamma, but the standard view is that mu and nu are by somebody later, is it not? Possibly even Michael of Ephesus. So do you think it would still work on the grounds that the material in the later books of the Alexander commentary is nevertheless sufficiently dependent upon Alexander?
No. I'm sorry. That was probably a misunderstanding. That's not what I meant to say. What I tried to show in my presentation, I think, is that what Syrianus is responding to is actually also Alexander in Metaphysics Alpha. So he's very much engaged with the arguments that
just Alpha.
Yeah.
Okay.
That Alexander in his comments on Alpha is quoting from On Ideas, for instance. So that's why it is quite clear that he's at the same time responding to those passages. So to Alpha, not of course to the inauthentic Alexander on mu and nu.
The other thing that I would like to raise a bit of a personal hobby horse, I suppose, is that I was really struck by those words in one of the Asclepius passages, mono to theo, which suits, I suppose, anybody's view of Aristotelian theology, but certainly not Syrianus's view of Platonic theology. I was wondering whether this is not further evidence that the theological metaphysical system of Alexandrian Neoplatonism is not a great deal simpler than it ever was under Syrianus and Proclus.
I can see your point, how this may be taken as an argument in that discussion, even though I may have a slight hesitation whether if the point were to be that there's just one God, that it may perhaps have been toi monoi theoi and not monoi toi. So I think here the stress is on the fact that, well, it's not something human, but it's in the demiurgic mind. But I can see your point nonetheless, that of course taking this idea very seriously of there being like a demiurge, which means one single creator in a sense, and not with this whole Platonic theology around it.
I think that there just needs to be one kind of God in particular that is right in the forefront of Asclepius's mind, as opposed to any other kind, shall we say. But I could be wrong here, but it seems to fit in with other things we know about the Alexandrian Platonism in general.
I mean, trying to find for some harmonization, you could also say, of course, well, even in Proclus, there would be one first demiurge, which in a sense is the first, the encompassing one. But yeah, I agree that the terminology here has a very different, makes one think about very different connotations, and would actually be grist to the mill of those who would actually want to see some kind of a difference there, which yeah, may actually be
grand.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. If there is no question, I could say a little bit on the last point. So my impression too was that, and that would be a third question, whether we could take this paramonoto theo as a very prudent Alexandrian allusion to the complex metaphysical and theological systems of the Athenian school, but very prudent given Ammonius' agreement with Peter Mongus. So he would be very careful, but still this would be like ring a bell to those who could hear it.
And then, so you mean, so you interpreted it in another sense than Harold?
So this was my first thought, and I was wondering whether you think it would work. I don't know what Harold would have to say about that. Could it ring a bell? Could it be meant to ring a bell to somebody who is also familiar with the complex structure of the Athenian school?
Yeah, that might be the case, but what kind of audience does Asclepius have for these lectures? If the audience is very well versed in some of these things and knows a lot of the background, then they might read a lot more into that passage as along your lines than if they are well, they won't be a group of first-year Aristotelian students, but maybe third-year Aristotelian students.
So if we posit a mixed audience, an audience of novices, but also of more advanced scholars who are in an inner cycle and who know more than young Christians who come to Ammonius school, perhaps this could be some kind of connection with the Athenian the Athenian hierarchies of gods and.
But Irene, could you perhaps explain, because I don't see it clearly very much. So at face value, Harold suggested in the first place that this formula seems to point at some like some one God there, but you say, well, it's despite this face value interpretation, it could also be a hint that there's more than this one God. There's this whole complex theology. Or
I think it could be taken. It is. My impression was that it could be taken in many different senses according to the audience. So a Christian could see here one God, but a pagan Neoplatonist could see more than that. Could see divine intellect or the divine at the level of the form. So if you do not get at the level of intellect, then you cannot you cannot contemplate the forms. So a Christian would be okay, but this would not offend the Christians. They would take it in one sense, and also a more advanced pagan student could understand it in a sense that was pointing to the complex metaphysical hierarchies of the Athenian school. So it is very diplomatic as an expression. That was.
I see.
That fits in well with what Olympiodorus says in the Gorgias commentary.
Yes, exactly.
He can think in monotheistic terms perfectly well, but nevertheless he can defend on in a sort of subtle ways the references in Plato to a plurality of divinities.
Exactly, that was the passage I was thinking of. So do not get upset by what I am saying, but
yes.
look at the meaning of what I say. So he says God, and the Christians can take it in one way and pagans in another way. And he has his own way, which is of course the pagan one, but he won't say openly.
I see. Yeah, sure. Nice. Thanks.
Any other questions or remarks? If there are not, then let us thank Peter once again for this great and very interesting talk. And let us renew our appointment for the 8th of November and Professor Harold Tarrant's talk on growing the profile of Platonic studies in Olympiodorus Alexandria. Thank you, Peter, and thank you all for being here and for the discussion. And see you on the 8th of November.
Thank you, Irini, for organizing this, and thank you all for engaging in discussion, for listening. So thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.